Hello everyone.
Hello there.
Now we're going to talk about our past today, and of course all of us are interested in our origin, etc. So I am sure you are interested in the origin of the British people, Ken Sensei.
Yes, the dim and distant past. Yes, well, of course, I think most people in UK are quite interested in their past, but I think it tends to be up to about Roman times. And there are certainly lots of fascinating Roman remains, as you yourself went to Vindolanda once.
I remember that.
Of course, we've all heard of Stonehenge, but I must confess I don't know too much about it. But how about you?
Unlike you, I am interested in Japanese history, but I haven't done much studying about it. But we have an excellent guest today to tell us all about our history. Now, our guest today is Professor Edward Kidder, who is Vice President for Academic Affairs at the International Christian University, and his specialty is art history and archaeology.
Well, we've got the right man for the Jomon period, haven't we? Welcome, Professor Kidder. Very nice to see you today. Over to you.
Well, you've been studying Japanese archaeology for a long time, and I'm sure you've been asked this question many times. How and why did you become interested in Japanese history?
Well, I was born and I grew up in China. And
Really?
I was always interested in the ancient arts of the Orient. And I'd hoped at some time or other I might be able to get back to China and do some work there.
Well, when did you actually leave China?
I left China in 1939 to go to college. Went to college and then
Things
war
got
service.
in the way.
And then, right, and then graduate school after that. And finally, I was teaching in St. Louis. I got an offer to come to ICU, Tokyo, and was very pleased with that and came. That was in 1956.
You came for a few years and you're still here.
Came for 3 years and stayed.
But originally you were interested in Chinese.
I confess I was,
history,
and that's the
weren't
way people were taught in the States at the time. There's very little being taught on Japan, as a matter of fact. That was just after World War II.
And could we say that you selected the Jomon period, or did
Well,
you...
shall we say I fell into it, the holes of the Jomon period. The ICU campus, the university campus, is actually a very marvelous site, actually more than one site. It's part of the whole string of sites along the little river there, which is situated along what they call the Kokubunji bluff line. And many, many sites, prehistoric Jomon sites along through there, and they go back quite a ways, too.
There's a map of the old ICU
Yes,
campus.
there is. The
And
white
those are all
areas.
sites, are they?
Those are all sites, above the bluff and below the bluff. And the little Nogawa is what's left of the Tamagawa today.
How long is Nogawa?
Well, it flows into the Tamagawa, but it's about 10 or 12 kilometers, something like that. Yes.
And so we've got Jomon people living there a long, long time ago. Well, anyway, before we actually go into the culture and talk about the people of the Jomon people in the Kanto region, I think for ignoramuses like me and perhaps one or two others, perhaps we should ask you, Professor Kidder, to tell us what the time range is and what period of history we're talking about.
Well, one of the interesting things about the Jomon culture is the unusually early invention of pottery, probably several thousand years earlier than anywhere else in the world, which has been very difficult for many people to accept, but it seems to be the case. And we would start around 10,000 years ago, something like this. And then one would find, through the Jomon period, as you see in this chart here, rising temperature, that reaches its peak about the end of early Jomon or middle Jomon. That's between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, somewhere along in there. Then it's tapering off. The temperature is declining to about what it is today, as a matter of fact. But the rising temperature means that the water levels are rising too, and Japan becomes increasingly isolated from the continent.
So we have 6 stages that you have chopped it up into.
From the 1930s, they've had 5, and in recent years they've added an earliest one, a super earliest one before that, yes.
I see.
So most people use the 5 stages today. Yes.
Now here we have an indication of the concentrations of population through sites, is it?
Right, just in sheer number of sites.
And so I take it that it's middle Jomon period that had the largest population.
That was the peak of the warming situation, and conditions were very good at the time in the central part of the country, where one had the northern and the southern forests mixed. There were very rich crops of nuts, walnuts, chestnuts, acorns, horse chestnuts, and many people then lived in that general area, kind of a central belt across Japan.
And what was the size of population at its peak?
There's been a very systematic effort recently to calculate the population. There have been many guesses before, but this is using the current techniques of computers and the like. And its peak may have been around 250, 260,000 in the middle Jomon period.
Well, it seems very small by modern day standards, but I suppose in those days it was quite a lot, was it?
Well, one wonders whether it wasn't too much, as a matter of fact, for the country.
Well, we may come on to that in a moment. Now, when did Jomon people really start living in Japan, or in the area that you are concerned with in the Kanto region?
Well,
here we have a picture of a very early map, I think.
Right. What we see here would be the land bridges at the time that the large animals came across from the north, from what they call a Korean route, and up from the south as well.
So you mean Japan was connected to the mainland?
Japan was connected to the mainland, and one had this huge lake, the Japan Sea, only. Otherwise, one simply walked across, and the people followed the animals.
And how many years ago was that? What period are we talking about?
This went on until about 18,000 BC, would be in the neighborhood of 18,000 years ago at least, would be the time when the first break took place, which would be in the southern part. This is worldwide warming condition. It includes the English Channel separating about that time too.
Here we have a picture, of course, of your area,
of the university campus. The Nogawa River is about in the middle of this picture. There's a highway just beyond that, and one of our first big Paleolithic sites. You can just see it in the middle left-hand side of this illustration. Most of the university campus is off to the right-hand side here.
Well, now, we would, of course, like to know something about the actual day-to-day lives of these mysterious Jomon people. Now, were they living in caves or in tents or in condominiums, or what were they in?
In rather good conditions, though, as a matter of fact. They built themselves what's usually referred to as pit dwellings.
Pit dwellings?
Pit dwellings. They dug below the surface as it existed then, and built above it a teepee-shaped structure, which means the walls and the roof are all one. And in this illustration here, from our Maihara site in Kogane City, you will see the post holes where the posts were fitted, and you will see many remains on the floor. Although this particular one has that extension at one end, you see at the top of the picture, which is quite unusual for most of these pit dwellings, and we're still in a quandary as to what that may have been used for.
What do you think it might have been?
Some people call it genkan, some people call it burial pit, or
whether it was something,
because it's usually only one of those in a collection of these pit dwellings.
Here we have the outside, so it was
this is the way you would reconstruct them, and the way they're probably reconstructed down here, where one doesn't need to have such heavy materials because conditions are warmer than they are up in the mountains.
And how many people were living in one of those?
It's generally thought that about 5 people could be comfortably accommodated. You measure this by outreached arms and a variety of other factors. And probably the average house could take care of 5 people fairly comfortably.
And then how about diet? Lots of goodies?
Well, in the Middle Jomon period, certainly, including not only the nuts, but yams and taro and lily bulbs and various berries and other roots and the like. And they could hunt animals. They had wild boar, they had deer, and they had some small animals and a few birds. But then one thing that they did, particularly in the latter stages of the Jomon period, was move toward the seacoast.
Ah, yes. Here we see on the chart, don't we, that the extent of gathering food.
Although they were collecting shells and eating the shellfish, the clams, the oysters and mussels and things of that sort for quite a long period of time, but they didn't go into this in a big way until the later stages of the Jomon period. There are about 2,000 of these shell mounds scattered throughout Japan, about 1,000 in this Kanto area, practically all on the east coast where you have a nice warm current coming up from the south, the cold current coming down from the north, and you get a mixture of these shells in the eastern side of the country. But if you go to a lot of shell foods, you are also not getting all that much nourishment from them. It's a lot of work, and it means that the groups, social groups that did that, probably were rather desperate to find their foods.
So yes, the food is beginning to disappear then.
That's right.
Yeah.
But in order to say hunt animals, for instance, you need some tools, some things to shoot them.
You really do,
And,
of course.
Professor Keita, you seem to have some artifacts in front of you.
I brought, as a matter of fact, I brought 2
vicious-looking
arrows.
thing there.
And, one of these that you see here is an obsidian arrowhead.
It's extremely small, isn't it?
It's very small, isn't it? It's this volcanic glass. We get it in our area from the Hakone Mountains, or we get it from the Shinshu, Nagano area.
Ah, yes.
They have to go quite a long distance to get this. And they bring it down in chunks and then work it very economically. So they waste very, very little of it. But this size, I think if you're going to kill a deer or a wild boar, you would have to tip it with poison. There's an aconite, a plant, which was available at the time. It's no longer used in Japan at all because it's so deadly.
Yes.
But that would work, I'm sure.
Now here we have a large selection of
Yes.
Tools? What sort of
Tools
things have we got
and the
there,
like.
Professor Kidder?
Generally on the left are the digging tools, the adzes, to dig out the pits for the houses, to cut the trees, and to cut the pampas grass and reeds and things like that they would use for the roof. Those very rough ones are Middle Jomon. On the right-hand side, you would find the smooth, the polished ones, which are late Jomon. Quite a new style that came in at the time. There are arrowheads, there are sinkers or weights for probably fishing, or maybe simple weaving, because there was probably a very simple costume made up of mulberry bark, something like this, very much like the Japanese used to use when they worked out in the rain in the fields.
And this may sound like a silly question, but I'm curious about that tiny arrowhead. From what sort of range do you think they would have fired such an arrow, or shot, I should say, such an arrow? I mean, would they have had 30 yards or something like that?
It's interesting. Probably you could get almost 30 yards out of it, but the remains of the bows which have been found are the long Japanese-style bow, not the short Ainu-style bow, which are shot from below the middle of the bow because they're so long.
I see.
And already they had the Japanese-style bow, which gives you a lot of power and a good deal of range.
Well,
Of course, we are going to have. What's this?
Well, I think what we
looks
have
like a
here,
cookie. to me.
Yes.
it does look like it, doesn't it? And there's some argument over this among American archaeologists, but we think these are the result of making fire, using
yes.
wooden sticks and making fire.
Gradually making an
And
indentation.
you find these dents only in certain types of stone, very rough material. It makes sense that way.
And what's that other?
That there is just the rim of a very large Middle Jomon pot. Those are usually highly decorated and quite attractive visually. And sometimes they, in that stage, they put these things upside down and seem to have buried infants in them, maybe
Really?
stillborn, perhaps.
And I mean, it's perhaps a little difficult for the audience to discover, but I mean, that's quite a large piece, isn't it?
That's quite a large piece.
What's
yes,
the
it certainly
diameter
is.
of that?
Diameter is
what?
15 inches.
15 inches, yes, that's quite considerable, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that was found on the ICU campus?
On the ICU campus. All this comes from the ICU campus.
Fascinating.
All the material in our museum comes from the ICU campus.
What sort of things have we there?
Those are the tools, the axes, adzes, for ground digging, for cutting the trees.
And can you date those within the Jomon period?
Yes, you can. Those are several different shapes for the middle Jomon period. I think this work was done by the men. You find quite a number of remains of men with their arms broken. The bones didn't heal very well. Not for women. They were working around the house, making the pottery and things like that. The men were out doing the heavy, hard work, apparently.
And then we see a nice pot there.
That's fantastic, yes.
That's a late stage of the middle Jomon, or around 2400 BC, somewhere along in through there.
Was this for decorative purposes? Or?
No, I don't think so. I think this was a cooking pot. Generally speaking, most of the food was just boiled together in one pot. But some of the foods, which were made of starch, from yams and lily bulbs and things like this, the yamaimo, it's a Yamato imo, not mountain imo, but Yamato, Japanese imo, that sort of things. They were made up into cakes of starch. And probably what one did with a thing like this, particularly we have examples where the constriction is fairly narrow, you would put a wicker lid in there, boil the water, and you would steam the starch.
So their cooking was quite advanced then?
Right.
Yes.
You'd have been quite at home in a Jomon kitchen. Yes. Well, Professor Keita, what about family life? Is it possible for you to tell us something about the sort of family existence? You mentioned there would have been perhaps 5 people in one of those houses.
Probably were about 5 to a house. That's the number you can accommodate comfortably. You're crowded, you're all over each other otherwise. But in the middle Jomon period, they redesigned the house so that the fireplace was put in the middle. That's how they could build those teepees like this, and they weren't too afraid of the house burning down as a result. And then they gathered around the fireplace, apparently. I think the family became very cohesive at that time. I think the characteristics of the tightness of the Japanese family could well have started about that time, but I'm sure that the architectural arrangements have a lot to do with this.
That's interesting indeed.
And then, were there villages or communities or what?
Although one may find many of these house pits in a given area, probably not more than about 5 were in use at any one time.
Really?
So that one suspects that the groups that moved together were not more than about 25. That seems to be throughout history. That's generally the case, and even in modern times when they talk about the dynamics of groups and so forth, they talk about the magic 25. So apparently from our information, the data we can gather, that's about it.
Interesting indeed.
They break down after that into smaller groups.
Then how about religion? Was there any formal religion or
well, there are
indication
remains of figurines, clay figurines, and things that indicate fertility cults. So whether the figurines were used for facilitating childbirth, one doesn't know, or perhaps some appear to have been broken intentionally. And they may be effigy magic in which a diseased person, and perhaps a shaman, a witch doctor you might want to call him, has gone through the process of, if the leg is sore, he breaks the leg, or something of that sort. And also some of them appear to be simulated burials. But that's more inclined to come when you have crops, when you have Neolithic conditions.
But clearly there was some, they were aware of higher spirits, etc.
They seem to have been aware of higher spirits, yes.
Well, we talk about a 10,000-year period, it's a long time, but what happened, really? You've hinted at all kinds of things, but how do you think the Jomon people came to an end or faded out, as it were?
It's a very complicated problem, but the population was certainly disintegrating, and large elements were moving north and others were just disappearing. I have had various theories, one of which is at present unsupportable, but that they got hold of plants. Now there are primitive people who select certain plants which they know are population controls or abortive, as a matter of fact. But inadvertently, probably, they were getting hold of certain plants, maybe the toxic characteristics in nuts might have had something to do with it. But they may well have just overexpanded. And
exhausted the available resources.
Yeah, right. And resources simply failed to replenish themselves adequately.
You suggested at one point when we were talking earlier that there was climatic problems as well.
There was. About the end of the Middle Jomon period, one reason for them coming out of the mountains appears to be several years of very poor nut crops resulting from heavy rains. And now they've discovered that it takes years and years for the forest to recover.
Ah, yes. We can see clearly, of course, can't we, from the charts, how the concentrations of sites...
Well, certainly over the centuries you may well have conditions like that, but under other circumstances with agriculture they can adjust. But it's a fragile sort of situation.
There's no question, was there, of conquest of another race or another group of people coming in?
No evidence whatsoever of that.
That's very interesting.
And even the next people coming in would not need to have conquered anyone. There's no one to conquer.
So by the time the Yayoi people came, Jomon people had disappeared.
There were a very, very small number of Jomon people in South Japan by the time the Yayoi people were coming in. Yes, and introducing rice and metals and things of that sort.
Well, we've talked exclusively about the Jomon period in Japan. Now, on the other side of Asia and Europe, there was a culture, development was also going on. Was it parallel with the Japanese Jomon period, or were there differences?
Once one gets into the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, there's a fairly rapidly moving culture to move into Neolithic and then the Bronze and Iron Ages and so forth, partly because most of those areas were in contact with each other, and there's a tremendous amount of stimulation among these different peoples. But Japan was not. Japan was isolated from the continent, and there just isn't the internal stimulation. This is just this case with the American Indians, too, as a matter of fact.
I see. So they're not really in parallel, the developments?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Interesting.
Well, when we talk about Japanese history and culture, we cannot ignore the Chinese influence. Now, can we see any trace of Chinese influence in the Jomon culture?
I wouldn't say in the Jomon culture. You have these strange, same animals which were on the continent, now extinct, of course. They were over here, but not really in the Jomon culture. Although I frankly think that the nature of the language, the Altaic connections in the language, belong to the early Jomon period, but
the
could come in
Chinese
from the north.
influence is much later then.
The Chinese influence itself is AD times, that's in the 600s.
Well, changing the angle now, you've been in Japan for nearly, well, over a quarter of a century, and I'm sure you have seen some change in Japanese archaeology.
Well, Japanese archaeology has changed a great deal, as a matter of fact. Major thing being the precision of field work and great improvements in that respect. But this is also true in other places in the world. But with a great deal of moral support from the government and also financial support on every level, there's been a tremendous number of people into Japanese archaeology. And a great deal is done, and this is stimulating, is competitive, and so on. And a great deal is known now about, I think, ancient times in Japan as a result of this. The volume of publications in Japan is just overwhelming, the site reports and things like that.
Are there many other foreign experts like yourself involved in Japanese archaeology today?
There's one man in Japan who's at Sophia University.
Ah, yes.
There are there's a small number in the States and in Canada. Very small number.
Member of good standing in the Japanese archaeological community, as it were?
I hope I am. I'm a member of the association as of recent years when foreigners were allowed to join. Yes.
Oh, that's very good news. A lot of people, I think, uninitiated foreigners particularly, think that Japan hasn't much in the way of archaeology because the buildings were largely made of wood, and therefore it's not so interesting, say, as the Middle East or something like that.
Perhaps it doesn't have the Greek temples, that sort of thing, you know, but it has archaeology all the way up to present times. Digging the subways and things like that, they find late Tokugawa glasses, eyeglasses. No? But there's, once you disturb the soil, it never goes back to its original condition. so every site, whether it only has post holes in it, as they find in these provincial capitals all over the country, the 8th century, those make very fine archaeological sites. Now, they're not things that you take home with you very much. There's some pottery remnants and things of that sort.
But there's certainly a lot of interest anyway.
There's a tremendous amount of interest.
Now, how about the archaeology as a whole? I mean, so many of these things used to be very much specialized things. Are there a lot of young people getting interested, Professor Kidder?
Yes.
I mean, is it an expanding field?
It's an expanding field, has been radically expanding in recent years. I think it probably is leveling off now. It's a job situation, other things like that. But it has been very greatly expanding.
And how about the problem that they have in Europe, particularly in England, on Roman sites and places like that, the amateur digger, and they have to keep these sites secret because people are rushing in trying to dig things up.
I know it, but it's much tighter in Japan. It's much better controlled in Japan. Yes, certainly.
And the government is, as you mentioned earlier, quite supportive.
Yes, yes, very much so.
And you are getting a lot more scientific techniques too, aren't you?
Yes, yes, and the government also has helped in that score, and we ourselves have help from chemists and the biologists, so on, because we simply have to know how the soil changes to tell us what the climates are and how those change and what the different plants are and all that sort of thing, what was available for food, all of this. The environmental archaeology is one thing that is a major, and we're doing a lot of it.
Well, anyway, Hiromi-san, we've learned a great deal today, haven't we?
About my people.
About your people, your ancestors, the dim and distant past. Well, Professor Kidder, thank you very much indeed for coming along today. It's been fascinating, and we've all learned a great deal, so all I can wish you is many happy days of digging in future.
Thank you very much.
So from us all here, it's goodbye until next time.
Goodbye.